it starts with really thinking about what's the organization's narrative. Because ultimately, if we haven't got a clear narrative at the top, then there is absolutely no chance that by the time, as you say, it gets like 4 or 5 levels down, that people are going to understand their individual roles.
I know it was eye-opening for me early in my career. I worked at eBay. I think it was like 13,000 people at the time. And it's funny, we had Rasky, the decision-making mongoose, which is like the nomenclature we used about how to set up who was responsible for any given meeting. I'll never forget that. I was like, okay, this is the most corporate internal comms, excuse my language, bullshit I've ever heard. And now that I look back, I'm like, no, understanding who was responsible actually was really valuable. Just the way that it was communicated internally was pretty cheesy. Marketing is like a team sport, but sometimes we're playing in different fields. For most companies, the lion's share of their budgets are spent on external communication, with their internal marketing comms being totally broken. Without internal team alignment, you run the risk of having fragmented messaging, which leaves your customers confused. According to Microsoft's Work Trend Index, 60% of teams report feeling disconnected from their leadership and company decision making since moving to hybrid work. And the symptoms of the comms problems are everywhere. Your product team launches features without your marketing team's involvement. The content team creates assets that the sales team never uses. Your CMO presents a strategy that never quite translates into tactical execution. It happens all of the time. When your marketing team isn't on the same page, your market position suffered. I'm Benjamin Shapiro, and today I'm talking with David Burnand, the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer at Staffbase. David has helped companies like Adidas, Sephora, and Rite Aid transforms how their teams communicate internally to make sure what they're doing externally makes sense. And he's going to share the playbook for how to align your marketing team around what actually matters. All right, let's jump in. David, welcome to the Martech podcast.
Thanks, Ben. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Excited to have you. Thank you for staying up late. You're calling from overseas. Where in the world are you?
I'm in the UK. Yeah.
In the UK.
Yeah.
All right. Well, communications is your specialty, and I appreciate you staying up late to do a little bit with us. And let's dive in and talk a little bit about this. There is this notion of our external versus our internal marketing communications. Let's say, start at the top. What do internal marketing communications look like when they're actually successful?
I think for me, if you think about what really matters here, it's around 2 things. So one thing is internally within your team. Like marketing, as you said, it is a team sport, and the specialities of the roles within successful marketing teams now mean that the collaboration piece is more important than ever. But actually, for marketing teams to actually really understand at an individual level, what am I doing? What part do I play in the overall strategy that we're trying to deliver? So I think that's a big part of it. I think it's about ensuring within big companies as well that organizations are actually able to, make best use of the output of marketing, that they have a good flow and accessibility of information. But I think the bigger piece for me is how we communicate the role of marketing within the organization and how we help the organization also to understand the role that they play in bringing the brand to life, because the marketing team is a part of it, right? But actually a brand doesn't just exist from what a marketing team does. It's the sum part of all of the experiences that any organization delivers, not just the advertising and the campaigns and all the stuff we do on socials.
I feel like there is a big sort of dynamic shift depending on how big your company is. If you're working at a startup, if you're a solopreneur, understanding the alignment between your goals and your marketing is just making sure you're sober when you start writing your marketing campaign copy, right? It's all in your head when it's a party of one. As your team expands, you need to start to define your goals and communicate that and make sure that there's some connection between a direction and your execution. But when you get into mid-market and enterprise, that connection between what the CEO is saying we should do and the direction we're going, and then his direct reports, direct reports, direct reports, direct report, writing the actual execution copy. So, how do you align that sort of communication flow to keep your team on the same page when it comes to, you know, 4, 5, 6 levels of depth within your organization?
I think for me, it starts with really thinking about, what's the organization's narrative? Because ultimately, if we haven't got a clear narrative at the top, then there is absolutely no chance that by the time, as you say, it gets like 4 or 5 levels down, that people are going to understand their individual roles. So I think part of it starts with the narrative, but then the other major aspect of it is, and that narrative has to be centered around the why. Like, why are we doing or everything that we're doing at that top strategic level? But then how does it break its way down into the marketing team and then the individual marketing functions? But I think the other aspect here is we oftentimes forget as marketeers that actually we have a responsibility to market ourselves and to communicate well internally within our organizations. And sometimes that gets lost. Sometimes we forget that. And actually, so, if you think about how a marketing team works, a huge chunk of this, if I think about the work that I do within Staff Base with my team, I have a team of around, I think we're around 80 people now. So big-ish marketing and comms team. A big part of what I do with my team is that repetition, that really just constantly bringing them back to, almost as running it as a mini campaign within the organization to think about, why are we doing the things we're doing? What are we trying to do? And what does that mean for you as individuals and as individual teams within the overall function?
You said one of the critical points was understanding the role of the marketing team. Give me some examples of different roles and structures marketing might play and how that affects their marketing comm strategy.
I think it really depends how broadly you're set up. And as you said, like if you're a startup, your role is very, very different, right? You're trying to get to an MVP or maybe trying to get you to your first customer. There's a very different situation to if you're, in a broad-based enterprise in software, or maybe you're a retailer where your structure could be much broader and the deliverables that you're expected to provide as a marketing team are very different. So for me, where the structures would vary depending on what the business strategy was, the maturity of the organization. And so within our marketing team at Staffbase, we take care of everything from comms and brand right through to digital customer success. That forms a part of our deliverables, and we have a central structure and then we have a regional structure. Not everybody's like that. If you're within an organization, for example, if you're in a big industrial conglomerate like GE or Siemens, maybe you would have a much more a structure much more based around the individual business units, because what you're selling within those individual units is so very specific. And then there are brands that are in between, right? So then there are retailers that have international presence. So they'll have that local flavor. They'll always want that local flavor, but fundamentally that brand experience, they want to be the same. Whether you're at H&M in New York or in Munich, it shouldn't matter.
We've all worked for companies of differentiating sizes, or at least most people have worked for some sort of a big company, hopefully some sort of a startup, and everybody at some point in their career should get that broad experience. I know it was eye-opening for me early in my career. I worked at eBay. I think it was like 13,000 people at the time. And it's funny, we had Rasky, the decision-making mongoose, which is like the nomenclature we used about how to set up who was responsible for any given meeting. I'll never forget that. And I was like, okay, this is the most corporate internal comms, excuse my language, bullshit I've ever heard. And now that I look back, I'm like, no, understanding who was responsible, who was an advisor, who, like, whatever the other acronyms were, actually was really valuable. Just the way that it was communicated internally was pretty cheesy.
Yeah.
But it served a purpose. And one of the things that I think is really hard to understand when you're running a larger marketing team or a larger organization, whether you're running it or whether you're just an operator, is understanding whether the internal comms are working, figuring out if you are actually aligned with the marketing team's goals, and are the marketing team's goals aligned with the executive team goals. So
Yes.
help me think about how you diagnose whether your internal comms are effective or not.
I think I would consider maybe four different things. So I would start with understanding the why. So if I was to ask anybody in the marketing team, why are you doing what you're doing? They should be able to ladder up and explain what their role is within the overall strategy that we're trying to deliver. I would say that if the flow of information is good, so I was at an organization, Viva Systems, and they had a principle called an operating principle that they called who needs to know. So your information flow is just really good. And you're really, you're not hung up on thinking, oh, I'm always a step behind. So is my information flow good? And if you do manage to do those two things, then I think two things happen. The first thing is that people are less hung up on who's doing what because they just sort of know. And as a result of that, they also make better decisions without managers having to always ask and to intervene.
Yeah, but how do you evaluate that? Like, is there a metric you can use to quantify, hey, information is flowing effectively, or
Yes.
my team understands the ethos of the company and why we're doing the strategic decisions? How do you measure?
So it's something that I think internal communicators have been actually quite poor at. I think it's the biggest elephant in the room. So for employee communications. So if you think about marketing like 10, 15 years ago, like when I was first kind of getting seriously into marketing, we would run campaigns back then, but it was like, well, we do cool stuff and everybody loves it and it's artistic and creative and so on and so forth. But it was like, please, please, please don't ask me for the results of these campaigns. And then over time, technology enabled us and we were able to, and these days, I mean, for us as a marketing team, I can tell you down to the dollar, I can trace revenue back to individual programs and the overall impact, the sum total of everything marketing delivers. Because we've been enabled by technology, communicators haven't had that. But I think the opportunity now, as communications technology really improves, you can actually set up campaigns, you can set up business, you can set up micro polling. You can ask people all the time, if you have the right tools, how bought in they are into a certain program. And you can use that to show the value, to understand, is this working? And to show to show business leadership, this is why we do these things in the same way that we do with marketing.
Yeah, I feel like if you're at a large enough company, you have an external comms team and a marketing team that's always communicating with the customers, hopefully. And maybe you have an internal comms team. But for most of us, it's on the executive leadership and maybe the marketing leadership as well to make sure you're communicating internally. So, talk to me about some of the tactics that marketing leaders specifically can use to implement ways to make sure that the internal communications are flowing effectively.
Yeah, I think so. I think some things that I would consider would be, firstly, treat your communications with teams like you would with customers. So you wouldn't just run an ad campaign once. Think about all the ads that we're bombarded with on social every day. We're so well targeted.
You mean everybody in the organization doesn't read every email and digest it? No way.
I think there's a risk that they may miss one or two.
I've got a team of 4 and I don't read half the emails. Sorry, guys.
I was going to say, how many unread emails do you currently have? I'm guessing a few.
I'm a zero inboxer, so unread, technically very few, but digested, different
Yeah,
story.
it's maybe a different thing, right? Yeah.
Send the message multiple times. I get you.
Correct. And then the other thing I would say is we need to avoid info bloat. So we're all so bombarded with things these days. So really thinking about how do we streamline communications and make it easy, going back to your point about things like, do I digest things or not? Avoid information bloat. And so really think about what are the things that my team really needs to know. Let's focus on those things and not send them other things, unnecessary distractions.
there's a balancing act there, right? Where it's, I want everybody to be on the same page and understand what the rest of the organization is doing and how we're all functioning together. But I don't want to give too much information so people can actually digest what I'm saying and understanding the activity of the marketing campaigns and team. How do you find the balance between keeping everybody on the same page and aware with actually giving them a chance to digest what's going on?
It's really hard. There's no one way to do it. But what I would say is if you think about a couple of things, one thing is leverage your managers. So depending on how complex your organization is, the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is kind of a study that's run for many years on the trust that people have in different things, not just companies, but also society, government, people they buy from, supermarkets, all kinds of things. What they found a couple of years ago was that actually people have more trust in their companies than they actually had in the Wall Street Journal and tablet, in terms of mainstream news. That's actually changed over the past 2 years. And because of all the things that have happened within companies, like trust between companies and their employees has actually declined quite significantly. However, there's an exception to this. And the one exception is managers. People tend to trust the managers that they are close to. That number has remained very high. And so the more you can use your managers to act as transponders for all of the key things that you need to communicate and allow them to filter out the things their teams don't need and equally let through the things that they do, that has a twofold effect. One is it clears away some of that information bloat. But the second thing is if it comes from the manager, the individuals in the teams are more likely to read it because they trust the manager. The higher up it comes from, the tougher it gets.
Yeah, I think understanding and isolating the points of communication and making sure that the information is trickling to essentially the loudspeaker, the loudest voice in the room
Yes.
tends to be the one that gets listened to. And for most people, that's their manager. The last question I want to ask you is about the technology and a little bit more about the implementation. How can technology enhance your internal communications? And really, what's the tech stack that we should be using to make sure that we're effectively communicating mission, goals, and strategy within our marketing team?
So I think going back to where we started, some of these things depend on the size of your organization, but assuming you're a reasonably big organization, I would say the first thing is decide on the types of technology that you need. So I would differentiate between what I would class as micro communication and collaboration. And for that, you might use Slack, you might use Teams, you might use Google Meet, GChat, for those micro interactions, of which we might have thousands every day. So that would be the first thing. So how do we use for that ongoing communication and collaboration that you have all day? But then the other thing is most organizations of a decent size also need a kind of a macro communications platform. We are one of them. So Staffbase is one of them. And we do a platform that spans across what we class as a modern intranet employee app, because most people these days access information on their phones rather than their laptops, especially frontline workers who often get forgotten in all of the communications that companies do. And then other things like SMS, email, digital signage, and so on and so forth. Now, I think having a macro communications platform is important for two reasons. The first reason is that it's multi-channel. So, going back to that idea of treating communications, internal communications with your team, you would treat your external customers, repetition, targeting, all of those things you can do with a multi-channel platform. And the second thing is it's separate. So you need some separation between those micro communications platforms and the thousands of messages people get every day. And then the big messages that you need larger teams to receive.
So help me understand why it's a separate platform. Because to me, if I'm consuming information, my inbox is the central hub, right? I get all my newsletters. I don't get all of my communications. I have Slack for sort of the ongoing thing. And so there's that dance between what you called the micro of like my inbox, my Slack, maybe there's some sort of another admin portal.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you push information into those channels where people are living? Why do you create a separate environment?
So you would use those channels. So for example, Staffbase does push directly into Teams and it does push into email inboxes. in order to, ensure that people are aware that there are important messages there. However, I think going back to that idea of noise, collaboration platforms where people do work, like Slack or Teams, they're noisy platforms, right? Within Staffbase, we have both Slack and Teams. If I had corporate news or big departmental news, it would easily get lost amongst the thousands of other messages I get every day. So I can use it as a reinforcement, i.e., there's something here for you, you need to read. So I might use it as a trigger, but actually much more effective to put it in people's pocket and send them a notification that is away from all of that other digital noise. That's why we think it's important.
Help me boil this down. What are some of the easy to implement tactics that marketing leaders can start to think about when they want to improve their internal marketing communications?
I think there's 4 things I would look at. Number 1, review your business goals. So really ensure that there is a clear line of sight between your business goals and your programs. It sounds obvious, but it isn't always obvious to your team. If you can't explain it, they'll never know. Second thing is build a narrative around the why. So going back to those business goals, be able to articulate, okay, not just this is what we're trying to do as a company, but then this is why we're doing these things within marketing. The third thing is think about the appropriate delivery mechanism. So really consider actually for this particular piece of information, what's the right thing? You have to be careful. Those macro platforms we talked about could also become bloated quite easily, right? And there's a balance to be struck in how you communicate. And then I would say the final thing is be authentic. Try not to be super corporate in your delivery. Try and get that connection, because the more you can connect with people, the more likely they are to buy into what you're trying to do, and the more likely they are to ultimately deliver for your business, which is ultimately what you're trying to do.
We're all thinking about consistency in our marketing efforts. We want our social campaigns to reiterate and reflect on what our email marketing says, on what our website says, to make this cohesive, great hug with our marketing campaigns around our customers. And it's not just a copywriting exercise, right? It's not a channel selection exercise. There is something about the internal reflection of your team that helps you get all of those touch points to sound and feel consistent. It's not just a tone and a style guide. It's teamwork. It's camaraderie. It's communication. It's the left hand understanding what the right hand is doing that helps make your marketing better.